That's pretty vague. I mean, did it disturb you? Did it excite you?
The sex talk is getting old.
We don't have to talk about it. Good.
You can't just keep shipping me off every single time you guys have an argument. You can't use me like that. That's bullshit. You can't even say I had any part in that. I had no part. You can't use that as the reason why you sent me here.
Scene 3 off Pepper becomes the film's most unsettling and revealing passage precisely because it strips away any illusion of neutrality around authority, therapy, and care, exposing how easily spaces meant to protect vulnerable young women can become sites of coercion when power is left unquestioned, and desire is framed as pathology rather than possibility. The scene opens with language that appears clinical and restrained, questions about reactions and feelings that initially seem designed to help Sydney articulate her inner world, yet the repeated narrowing of acceptable answers quickly signals that this is not a dialogue but a funnel, guiding her toward conclusions that have already been decided for her. Sydney's reluctance to elaborate, her fatigue with sex talk, and her request to move away from the subject are not signs of avoidance so much as attempts to assert boundaries in an environment that subtly discourages them. And this dynamic resonates with many women who have learned that saying, "I don't want to talk about this," is often interpreted as resistance rather than self-knowledge. The shift from discussion to confrontation happens gradually, almost imperceptibly, mirroring how manipulation often operates in real life, not through dramatic force, but through persistence, reframing, and the erosion of consent by repetition. When Sydney's family conflict erupts into the scene, the emotional stakes widen, revealing her as a young woman already positioned as a bargaining chip between adults, sent away during arguments, blamed without clarity, and made to feel responsible for tensions she did not create. Her anger toward her father, and her sense that her parents use her as a battleground, speak to a broader institutional failure, where children, particularly girls, are expected to absorb emotional fallout quietly, developing detachment as a survival mechanism rather than being offered genuine support. This familial instability contextualizes Sydney's vulnerability in the therapeutic space, as she has learned that adults often prioritize their own narratives over her lived experience, making her especially susceptible to authority figures who claim certainty. The brief, tender exchange between Sydney and Carrie following the argument downstairs is crucial here, not because it advances romance, but because it demonstrates what mutual recognition looks like when it is not predicated on hierarchy. Carrie does not interrogate Sydney's feelings or redefine them. She simply acknowledges them, offering truce rather than diagnosis, and this moment of peer-level empathy starkly contrasts with the dynamic that follows in the therapist's office. Carrie's ability to say, "I really felt it downstairs," without assigning meaning or judgment, models an emotional honesty that respects Sydney's autonomy, highlighting how care does not require interpretation to be valid. When Sydney explains that she is in therapy because her lack of interest in dating has been deemed abnormal, the film lays bare a cultural reflex that continues to shape queer women's lives. The assumption that deviation from heterosexual scripts is a problem to be fixed, rather than a reality to be understood. This framing is not relic of the past. It persists today in subtler forms, through social pressure, medicalization, and the insistence that desire must follow a predictable timeline or orientation to be legitimate. The therapists later return to sexual curiosity as evidence, cataloging Sydney's moments of interest and drawing conclusions from them, exemplifies how institutions often treat queerness as something to be proven through data points rather than lived experience, ignoring the possibility that curiosity, attraction, and identity do not always align neatly or immediately. Sydney's insistence that she would know if she were a lesbian reflects an internalized myth, one reinforced by cultural narratives that portray queerness as obvious, overt, and unmistakable, leaving many queer women feeling fraudulent or confused when their self-understanding unfolds slowly or quietly. The scene becomes most disturbing not because of any single action, but because of how authority is used to override Sydney's uncertainty, reframing her bodily reactions as evidence without her consent and positioning the therapist as the ultimate interpreter of her truth. This dynamic mirrors real-world abuses of power that occur when professionals conflate access with entitlement, assuming that proximity to vulnerability grants permission to redefine it. The language of expertise, "it's my job to know," becomes a weapon here, silencing Sydney's self-reporting and reinforcing a hierarchy in which her own understanding of her body and emotions is treated as secondary to institutional authority. The invocation of secrecy, assurances that certain things do not need to be shared with her mother, further isolates Sydney, cutting her off from external validation and reinforcing the idea that this space exists outside ordinary accountability. This tactic is especially resonant for queer audiences, as secrecy has historically been both refuge and trap, a means of survival that can also be exploited by those who claim to offer understanding while demanding silence. The therapist's framing of repression as Sydney's problem reflects a broader societal tendency to individualize distress that is actually produced by systemic pressures, ignoring how cultural hostility toward queer women fosters confusion, fear, and delayed self-recognition. By presenting repression as a personal failing rather than a learned response to stigma, the scene exposes how easily institutions absolve themselves of responsibility while placing the burden of resolution on the most vulnerable. Symbolically, Sydney represents the young queer woman caught between competing narratives, her family's demand for normalcy, society's insistence on heterosexual milestones, and her own unformed but persistent sense that something about these expectations does not fit. The therapist, in contrast, embodies institutional power that masquerades as care, using the language of confidence and certainty to rush Sydney toward conclusions she is not ready to claim, illustrating how authority can exploit longing for clarity. Carrie's presence, though largely absent from this latter portion of the scene, lingers as a counterpoint, representing a form of connection that is messy, imperfect, but fundamentally non-coercive, grounded in shared experience rather than diagnosis. For women broadly, this scene resonates as a cautionary portrait of how vulnerability is often met with control, how expressions of uncertainty are treated as invitations for others to decide on one's behalf, and how institutions frequently fail those they claim to serve by prioritizing order over empathy. Society's discomfort with women loving women persists not only in overt discrimination, but in these quieter mechanisms, where desire is scrutinized, categorized, and managed, rather than allowed to unfold organically. This discomfort is rooted in a fear of autonomy, particularly female autonomy, because women who define themselves outside prescribed norms challenge systems built on predictability and control. By depicting the therapist's overreach without sensationalism, the film refuses to eroticize or normalize the abuse of power, instead inviting viewers to sit with the unease of recognizing how easily trust can be weaponized. For queer audiences seeking authenticity, the scene offers not affirmation but recognition, acknowledging the painful reality that self-discovery often occurs alongside harm, and that becoming visible sometimes requires first identifying the forces that have tried to define you without your consent. The scene ultimately underscores the necessity of reclaiming one's narrative from institutions that mistake authority for insight. And it affirms that true understanding cannot be imposed, only supported, a truth that remains urgently relevant for queer women navigating systems that still struggle to see them as the experts of their own lives. Scene 4 Pepper operates as a deceptively simple domestic exchange that quietly crystallizes the film's central tensions.